There's a phenomenon that takes place in religions where there's a charismatic leader. And that charismatic leader has a vision. Being a leader necessitates having a vision. Because if you're a leader, just the etymology of the term, what are you doing? What do leaders do? They lead. That's right. And so if you're leading people, then that means you have somewhere to lead them. If you have somewhere to lead them, you can call that a vision. The very nature of a leader is that leaders have vision because they're leading people who are following them and they're leading them somewhere. Even if it's into a ditch. Maybe their vision is to do something really foolish, but nonetheless, the very nature of leadership is that it requires as a precursor a vision. Something can be attractive, but that's not the same as leadership. Something can be popular, but that's not the same as leadership. Leadership means you get people to follow you. So there has to be some charisma. There has to be some popularity, even if it's on a limited scale. And there has to be a vision. Do you guys follow this? This is just basic English. That's all we're doing here. So this happens. A charismatic leader will give birth to a group of followers, which we can call a movement. The act of following creates movement, and therefore you call a group of people working towards a goal a movement because they're moving. You guys following this? Again, this is just English. So a charismatic, attractive, popular personality who is a leader and therefore must have a vision convinces people to follow her or him. And the act of people following and the leader leading creates a movement. But then inevitably, the leader fails and falls short and hypocritically acts and upsets his followers. No, that doesn't always happen. That might happen somewhat regularly, but that doesn't always happen. But there is one thing that definitely always happens with a leader eventually. You know what that is? They die. That's right. And when the leader, who was a charismatic figure, who attracted a movement of people who followed his or her vision, when that leader dies, that is called the post-charismatic phase. Do you follow that? Post, after, charismatic, the period of time when the charismatic person, the person filled with charisma, who attracted and was popular and convinced people with that vision to follow and thereby create a movement, after that time, the next phase comes in. The next phase is the post-charismatic phase. Do you guys follow this? Now, Hinduism has kind of Hindu movements, generally speaking, have a big crippling feature. They have a crippling feature which stops them from growing too big. That crippling feature is the role of a living guru is valued tremendously. And so a particular charismatic figure, a leader, someone with a vision, who's able to convince people to follow him or her, when that person dies, then people go find a new leader to follow. That makes sense? Right? But that new leader may have a different vision than the pre-existing leader. And therefore you end up reinventing the wheel every generation. Now we try to fix that. We create a disciplic succession, also known as a parampara, also known as a pranali, also known as a sampradaya. We got a bunch of words for it. And so we create a lineage, a line. And the teacher teaches his students, who then are able to represent his or her teachings. You can represent them. You present them again. Represent. Did you ever notice the word represent means to represent? Yeah, you notice that? Did you notice that before I told you or after I told you? Huh? It's interesting, isn't it? We know that term, right? I'm representing, right? It's a representative. Represent. Presenting again. So we have this idea that you have to become a good disciple, then you can become a good guru. Discipleship comes first. We have a parampara, which means literally from one to another. We have a pranali, we have a line. And so, that's an attempt to overcome the idea that each new guru has a different idea. But let's say you find a pure follower who represents what you taught perfectly. You're a leader. You're the charismatic leader. You die. You appoint a successor who is capable of representing what you taught. You follow? What happens after you die when your representative jumps in and takes over and carries on your legacy? Can't hear you? No. You guys don't know what happens? The movement fractures. Do you know why the movement fractures? Why?
Some people are into the new leader and some people aren't.
Yeah. Again, we're just kind of doing English here, guys. Like real common sense stuff. It doesn't take a whole lot of philosophy. This is just, I don't know, like a 12-year-old who's paying attention. Haven't you guys noticed this happens? A big guru dies, appoints a successor. We don't do that in this country. Prabhupada spotted this, and so he didn't do this. But all of Prabhupada's godbrothers, every other month is what they do. They appoint a successor. And every single time the main charismatic figure dies and appoints a successor, half the movement splits. Sometimes 75%. Depends on that new person. And I mean, sometimes they'll get big with it. They'll write their will. If you are my follower, you must follow this person. They'll write their mantra, like the disciples say. They'll begin the process of worshiping and that guru initiating while they're still on the planet. But still, as soon as they're gone, the whole thing falls apart. Because the nature of charisma is it's not simply codifiable and transmittable. There's a je ne sais quoi, a certain something that cannot be said. Just a certain something about each leader that's unique to them. Even when you look at Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's followers, each one of them was empowered by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to do something different. One taught Rasa Tattva, the other one taught Bhakti Siddhanta, the other one taught Bhakti Prayojan, the other one taught Vairagya, some of them taught renunciation, or the perfect goal of spiritual life, or the methodology of spiritual life, or they established the fundamentals of the tradition, or the proper conducts one should follow, or different nuanced philosophical principles. Each one of them was differently empowered. Even they're in the same lineage. Their voice sounds different. They play harmonium differently. They speak differently. They have a different personality. And that's part of what creates that movement. That's part of what they bring to the table. There's certain basic features everyone in our tradition should have. They should have Krishna Prema. They should be free from anarthas. They should have mastered our scriptures. But then within that basic category of a bona fide Vaishnava, bona fide, you guys know what the word bona fide means? Bona fide. Bona, yeah.
Good faith.
Yeah, fide means faith. Bona is like bueno. And so, good faith. The word faith comes from fide in Latin. Bona fide, good faith. Someone who has the qualifications that allow you to accept them in good faith, the basic qualifications. Each individual is still an individual. Somebody's not a cutout for somebody else, or a carbon copy or a clone. Rather, each person is a unique individual. And that's part of what forms that movement around them. That's part of their vision. And in addition to the basic features that may be replicatable, that may be transferable, there is a fundamental aspect of charisma which is not transferable. Do you guys follow this? I mean, here's one. You pick a young guru to succeed you. Well, people were attracted to you because you were old and wise. Now your young disciple comes along, right? Okay, let's say you don't do that. Well, then you got a big problem, because if you pick the old timer to represent you, then what happens? He dies in 5 years. And it's just sometimes you'll get that. They'll pick the senior most guy in the mutt. And then every 5 years they're switching acharya, and they can never gain any momentum there either, because everybody's just got a couple of years before they kick the bucket. So on one side, the next guy might have his own vision. On the other side, even if he doesn't, the followers are going to feel differently. And so Hinduism is in this constant process of tearing down and losing its momentum. There's a way around this. If you want to know what the way around this is, you got to look at traditions which don't have this problem. What traditions don't have this problem? No, we have the same problem. Prabhupada did his best, and we seem to be okay. We don't lose as many people. But every time a guru dies, there's a problem for his disciples. Another tradition. Come on, guys. Christianity. Does Christianity have this problem?
No.
No, they don't. Why don't they have this problem? They have other problems. But they don't have this problem. Why don't they have this problem?
They don't put as much emphasis on living guru.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is just English, a little bit of common sense mixed with a minimum, like a minimal level of memory. Remember when I said Hinduism has a big problem because it places a huge emphasis on a living guru? I said the other traditions doesn't have a problem. Why not? Well, there you go. How did they get around this whole guru thing? First of all, they created the gurus. They had something called the Pentecost. 50 days after Jesus was resurrected, he went back to heaven and he imbued his disciples, his apostles, with the power to represent him. It's called the Pentecost. It's there in the New Testament. It's a huge, huge feature of the church. It's essentially the creation of the church. Jesus was a charismatic figure. He left and he transferred his charisma and authority to his followers, known as the apostles, 12 apostles. And Paul, kind of an apostle all unto himself, even though he never met Jesus. And they wrote, and they all had a different take on things. If you read the 4 Gospels, which tell the story of Jesus, they all tell it differently. One of them really tells it differently. You know who that is? John. How come you're not answering these questions? You don't know this? There's 3 Gospels which are called synoptic. They tell the same story. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Generally speaking, it's understood that Mark came earliest and Matthew and Luke followed Mark because the basic structure of Mark's story is repeated with some embellishments. And everything in Mark is repeated in Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke have a number of details that aren't in Mark, and Mark's story is more Spartan. So they come up with this through philology, through textual criticism, historical textual criticism, what used to be known as philology. When they were trying to figure out the Bible, they came up with this idea that Mark is probably the earliest one. They also came up with this thing called Q theory. There seems to be another text that Matthew and Luke were drawing from. They call that Quellen theory. So there was another text which seems to have been lost in time. That theory has fallen out of favor. But irrespective of that, you have 3 Gospels which tell basically the same story, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then one which is just out in left field, and that's John. So those 4 Gospels tell different stories. And in fact, you find Peter arguing with people in the Bible. You find James arguing. Seems like James and Paul would have really hated each other. They don't seem to get along at all. You find Paul rising up against the 12 apostles. You find the 12 apostles getting together and saying what Paul did that was okay and what Paul did that wasn't. You got letters being exchanged back and forth where these apostles argue with each other, and that's the New Testament. Are you aware of this? It's these arguments about what the tradition should be, and do all Christians have to be vegetarian, or do they have to eat meat, or can they eat meat from pagan altars? And do they have to follow the rules of Mosaic law? Do they have to get circumcised? There's all sorts of stuff they get into. So then they did something big. You know what they did that was big? They came up with a creed. In 324, 325 AD, they came up with a creed called the Nicene Creed. Nicaea, which is very close to Istanbul, maybe 50 kilometers away from Istanbul. They met there in Nicaea, and they put together the Nicene Creed. And all the major players of Christianity showed up, and they voted. And they decided on the basics of Christianity, and they wrote it down. Then if you didn't follow those basics, they killed you, or suppressed you, or burned your books. And eventually, those people, the followers of Arius and other personalities, were just gone. They were off the table. And if you look at modern day Christianity with its 3 billion members, 99.99% of them follow the Nicene Creed. It's the basic document of Christianity. And that was an attempt to get around the infighting and the various philosophical ideas by voting and deciding on one thing that everybody would do and reaching a consensus. A consensus does not mean, a deliberative consensus does not mean that everybody agrees. It means that you have a period of time where you discuss the issue and then you vote, and then the majority rules, and the people who lost have to abide by that. Prabhupada actually set up a similar structure in ISKCON. He asked the GBCs to follow the rules of parliamentary procedure to create a deliberative majority where they voted, and certain things have to pass by 2/3, certain things have to pass by a simple majority, 51%. He said what the number of people serving on that body would be, and he had a process for deliberation. They have a gavel, and there's a chairperson, and they conduct meetings, and they vote on stuff. It's an attempt to try to get around different endless opinions, and everybody, trying to a vox populi situation, where popularity means you're right. Now, what's the downside of writing it all down and codifying it and creating a body of literature to replace that living guru who's fallible necessarily simply because? What? Can't hear you? Yeah, I don't know that it means. First of all, I believe I'm a soul in a human body. So I don't necessarily believe that being a soul means I'm fallible. Number one. So I don't agree with that, although that's a popular saying. But the gurus, the living gurus, aren't necessarily fallible because they will eventually die. That's a failure. They can't perpetuate the movement forever because they're going to die, and then it's not going to last anymore. And then you're going to be back to the drawing board and reinventing the wheel. You follow this? I don't think that makes them fallible in the sense of a hypocrite or fallible in the sense of possessed of some inadequacy, except for dying is somewhat of an inadequacy. For instance, does Krishna die? No. Is that a significant point about Krishna's divinity? Yes. So being in a body that's going to die, it's a problem. So how do you get over it? You write a book. Do books die? They do not. Can they be copied down? They sure can. Can they be meticulously copied down? Potentially ad infinitum? They can. So everybody should just write a book and get rid of the gurus. What's the problem with that?
Anyone can give their own interpretation.
It is true. That is true. However, when we look at 40% of the world's population, Christianity, 3 billion of 7.5 billion people, and you look at the Nicene Creed, 99.99% of Christians follow the Nicene Creed. You ever read the Nicene Creed? Who's read the Nicene Creed? How similar is it to Christianity anywhere you go in California?
Sums it up.
It's unbelievable how much, what's the word I want to use, consistency there is and congruence there is amongst various denominations of Christianity. They did a great job of just distilling it down to the essence and passing it on. A good creed has staying power. Like, what's a good creed? We hold these truths that are self-evident, that all men are created equally and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Here's another one. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to ensure the blessings of liberty, to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. There's like a lot of staying power in these documents, isn't there? I don't even know how I know that. I do. It was part of my cartoons growing up. The commercials would have that in the cartoons. Good credos. They stick, man. They're almost Shakespearean. Good idea sticks around. What goes around comes around. Who said that first? Some of these ideas are they're so woven into the very essence of the human condition that we almost don't even know where they come from. It seems like they must have arisen in any society of thoughtful human beings anywhere in the world. And you can't actually trace out the absolute provenance of something, where it came from originally. There's another, what I think is a more fundamental problem with getting rid of living gurus, like the Christians did. Do you know what it is? And not all Christians, some Christians. I mean, you have the Holy Roller churches and the evangelical churches, some of which are really heavy into personality cults. Turn on your TV, you'll see it's still the rage. Can't keep a good guru down. I think the fundamental problem is that there is something absolutely essential about charismatic figures who have visions, who lead. You don't read a book and get a vision from a book. You talk to a person, you get a vision from a person. This is so important that Bhaktivinoda Thakur said sacred literature, Shastra, is the words of the scripture spoken through the mouth of a devotee. He was unwilling to consider this to be Shastra. This had to go through this of a devotee for it to become Shastra, for it to become pregnant. The Bhagavatam says it mixes with the saffron particles when it passes through the mouth of a devotee. And it becomes empowered to change your life. Is that true? When you meet a person who's convinced about something, who's mastered a subject, do they bring a book to life in a way that the book is not brought to life if you just read it yourself? Yeah, that's true. So if we blow it by having living gurus, and the Christians solved our problem but create another problem by having just a credo, what do? You have both. Silly. Do you follow this? And what is scriptures? Scriptures are the great ideas of charismatic personalities that have been written down so they become part of the legacy of that tradition that transcends space and time. They don't fully replace having a living teacher who can troubleshoot your life and dig into your life at the moment you're living, dealing with the things you're dealing with, and give you intricate answers to your questions. But you're able to cross-check that modern day teacher's teachings with the predecessor teachers. And he's able to springboard off of those teachings and breathe new life and demonstrate new applicability that you might not have noticed on your own. And so these things work together, where I'm not just speaking on my own, and you're not just left with the book. I have a book to look at. I also have teachers who can answer me. As I'm speaking, I can check my knowledge against the book, but that doesn't prohibit me from having my own parametered, sculpted realizations that are congruent with, but allow me to express some of my own unique realization while staying congruent with the core tradition. That's good religion. Without that, you're just left with an empty book. Or you're just left with a modern day teacher. But when you start to build this legacy of teachers and their writings, and the next teacher, and the next teacher, and the next teacher, and fidelity, and taking the predecessors into account, you now start to have a very powerful, thick tradition, really sturdy, that can withstand time. That does revitalize itself every generation. And at the same time, doesn't just take a rebirth every generation. Did you guys follow that? If you don't do this, you end up with a book of rituals. If you don't do this, you end up with a bunch of rules without a heart. You end up with the letter of the law without the spirit of the law. Otherwise, you end up with spirit, but if you look at, like about 50 years ago, a bunch of lawyers got together and wrote out a sample of a legal code for a state. And now that code is used by 40 states with some small adjustments. But they just borrow the same basic language. If you go from state to state, you'll find they have much of the similar language. And it took them about 15 years. And, dozens and dozens and dozens of lawyers with grants working on this to just figure out how to put everything together and write a complete system of legal codes. Do you follow this? I mean, the Constitution was written pretty quick. Declaration of Independence was written pretty quick. But the ideas that it was pulling from go back to Plato. And so there was, thousands of years of thought. And the framers of our Constitution were familiar with that, and even recent stuff which would come up, social contract theory and natural law versus, social order. They came up with all sorts of cool stuff, but they were borrowing. They added some bells and whistles, but they were borrowing by and large because it's too much to come up with on your own. You have to reinvent everything. Better you have a nice map and you can just put a few flourishes. Like proofreading something is so much easier than writing something. Editing something is so much easier than writing something. And so now you've got these books which have answers to all of life's questions. They've been put together by a tradition. And then it's things have been troubleshot over centuries and millennia. And you still have teachers, and those teachers master those books. But it's not just out of the law, they also imbibe the spirit of the law. And there's room for charisma, and there's also room for fidelity and loyalty. And those two things together make a very powerful combination. Did you guys follow that? This is the birth of a religious movement and the evolution, and when religious movements become powerful enough to stay. They create a sense of connection to people who have passed away. And they can demonstrate that connection in a way that makes it clear, yes, we're a legitimate chain to get to there. But there's also room for living. And actually, there's always room for a living touch. Nobody just reads the Bible and becomes a Christian. What happens is you're raised learning Christianity with your cartoons. Then you fall away. And then in a moment, like a drunken stupor, in a moment of like great hardship, you pull out the Gideon Bible and you decide to become a Christian. But nobody has no idea what the Bible says and just reads the book and goes, I want to be a Christian. It doesn't work like that. That's why people aren't converting in Buddhist and Muslim and other countries where Christianity is not taught to people as their birth religion, as their birthright. They don't just read the Bible and become Christians. Rather, they're already predisposed towards Christianity, and then maybe they revitalize it a little bit in a moment of difficulty. But they've already sort of decided what their revelation is going to be from before they can even remember because they drank it with their mother's breast milk as children. Do you guys follow that? there's actually no way to get around having living teachers, having living people who inspire you. Whether that was your parents when you were a kid because they told you this is the way, the truth, and the light, or whether that was a preacher, or whether that was whoever it was, somebody inspired you. Somebody brought those letters to life. And so it's not really even a question of, do you have living teachers? Every tradition does. It's, do you acknowledge that? Do you work that into your tradition? Or is it just something which is going on subtextually and subconsciously behind the scenes, unacknowledged? So a good tradition will have both elements acknowledged, and to some extent acting as polarities that are played off each other as you're breathing in and breathing out, and you can really do something. You've got a check and balance system. And you can demonstrate fidelity, going back to where you said you came from. And not just as somebody saying, oh, I'm practicing ancient Egyptian religion, but there's nothing connecting them to ancient Egyptian religion other than them just saying they're connected. You can show that. You look at like the Catholic Church as a simple example. They can show you their connection through 1,800 years of popes and saints and pundits. You know, if you see the Pope and he writes a papal decree, oftentimes, like a Jesuit, like our current Pope is a Jesuit, which means he's a pundit, they'll cite stuff written in 400 AD, 500 AD, 900 AD. They'll cite multiple sources in the original language in a document, demonstrating that they are building on the work of their predecessors. You see it. You know it's you might not agree with the tradition, but you can see the fidelity and a lifetime given to mastering the law. And to those legal precedents, you know, they live in their mind, part of the way they view the world. Okay. All that was a warm-up to look at what I want to look at today. Krishna says in the Gita, Jnanena tu tat ajnanam yesham nashitam atmana. Tesham aditya vaj jnanam prakashayati tat padam. Tu tat jnanam. But that jnana, but by that jnana, tu tat jnanena, but by that jnana, but for one whose nashitam atmana, for one whose ignorance has been destroyed by that jnana. Two, but nashitam atmana, for one whose ignorance is destroyed, jnanena tat, by that jnana, by that knowledge. Yesham, for such a person. Tesham, for that person. Aditya jnanam, that knowledge is like the sun. Prakashati tat padam, which illuminates the Supreme. When, however, one is enlightened with the knowledge by which nescience is destroyed, then his knowledge reveals everything as the sun lights up everything in the daytime. The sun is a powerful metaphor for knowledge. We talk about this. We say, you know, ajnana timirandasya, I was in the darkness of ignorance. And then jnananjana, the salve you apply, shalaka, you apply the salve of knowledge to my diseased eyes which were blinded with the darkness of ignorance. Chakshu umilitam yena, and by that my eyes were opened. Tells my Shri Gurave Namaha, I offer my respects to such a teacher. Chakudam viloje, the one who gave me eyes. Jame Jame Prabhushe. He is my Prabhu. He is my master. He's my Lord. Again, about the Guru. So the sun is like the ultimate illuminator. Fog burns off. Darkness is gone. Even the worst clouds cannot take away the sun. The sun still permeates and lights up the sky. Even if you get a full-blown monsoon, it's not dark like night. The sun still blasts through even those thick rain clouds and lights up the sky. It's unbelievable. The sun is this powerful metaphor, illustrator of what knowledge does for people. It changes the world you live in. Once you know there's a car coming, you're walking across the street. Once you know a car's about to hit you, you jump out of the way. It's automatic. The knowledge, to some extent, is functional in that the possession of that knowledge forces you to act. Many things in life, once you know them, you can't unsee them, and you actually become transformed simply by the existence of that knowledge. Again, you're walking across the street, a car is coming, immediately you jump out of the way. Without even thinking about it. You don't decide, I'm going to jump out of the way now. It just happens automatically. The moment that knowledge becomes aware of you, made aware. Knowledge is this illumination. It's adityavat. It's like the sun. Because nashi tamakana, it destroys the agyana, the ignorance of the self. By knowledge, the ignorance, which is avritam, covers the self, is destroyed. Just like the sun lights up the world. And all of a sudden you can see yourself and see everything else. So the knowledge here that you get, how do you get that knowledge? The knowledge which is spoken of here, how do you get it? Huh? Well, that is not the obvious answer. The obvious answer of where this knowledge comes from is from the book, because I'm reading the book where the knowledge is located, and we're discussing the book. So the first, most obvious answer to the question would be from the book. Isn't it? Right? And then Krishna also says, Tad vidi pranipatina pariprashna sevya upadekshanti te jnanam. They can give you knowledge. They can point you towards knowledge. Who? Jnaninas, those who know. Tattvadarshana, those who have seen the truth. Again, the idea is used of seeing the truth. They can give it to you because they've seen it. Because they have the knowledge, they can give it to you. So that verse of the Gita, which is a text which we're now using to gain knowledge, tells us that we have to get the knowledge from a person. Therefore, which one is true? They're both true. There's a text you need to get the knowledge, and there's a person you need to get the knowledge. And just looking at the Gita with a little bit of common sense, being informed by the things we just talked about, you can see these ideas encoded within the Gita. The idea of needing a teacher and simultaneously needing books. Do you guys follow that? In fact, what's our main text? Huh? No. What's our main text? Huh? You guys gotta stop mumbling and just talk loud. I mean, it's like, I don't have bad hearing. Huh? What's our main text? The Bhagavatam is our main text. 100%. If you think it's not, you're wrong. What's our main text? That's our main text. Bhagavat. The Srimad Bhagavat. The word Bhagavat means of Bhagavat. Bhagavat means the person who's endowed, just like Adichavat. And so this is Bhagavat. The person who's endowed with bhagas, qualities, like strength, fame, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. And so Krishna is called Bhagavat because he's filled with all sorts of spiritual qualities. And then the book about Krishna is called Bhagavat. That's how it works. You elongate. You add a guna to the first syllable and it becomes Bhagavat. So the Bhagavat is the book about Bhagavat, about the Lord. It's actually bhagavadgita. But because T and G, one's soft and one's hard, it's hard to say bhagavadgita. Then the T softens to a D and it becomes bhagavadgita because it rolls off the tongue. And hard syllables become soft. So a T becomes a D. Just like Jagatnath becomes Jagannath to make it easier to pronounce. So the Bhagavad Gita is the words of Krishna. The Bhagavatam is the book about Krishna. Not the song of Krishna, it's the book about Krishna. Interestingly, the word Bhagavat is also a term used for a devotee. Devotees are known as Bhagavats because they're of God. They are about God. They've given their lives to Krishna. And therefore they become Krishna-esque. They become illuminated by Krishna. So the word Bhagavat is used both for our core text as well as for the devotees who teach that text. Did you guys see what I just did there? What did I just do there?
You connected the two religious sources that you're talking about, which sometimes can be in conflict with each other.
That's right.
You've shown them to be the same.
That's right. So I spent the first 2/3 of class explaining charismatic phases and post-charismatic phases and what happens to religions and the downsides and problematized stuff and showed the good sides and the bad sides. And I came up with there's these two critical faults. One is just the book and the other is just the person. And I gave evidence for how a good tradition has both. Then I showed you in the Gita itself, Krishna recommending both. Then I showed you that the very word we use for our sacred text is also the same word we use for the devotee. Did you guys follow that? That's a mic drop moment, guys. Did you guys follow that? Did you follow what I just said? The word used for a devotee in Sanskrit is the same word used for a spiritual text, thereby showing how they're both two sides of the same coin. They're both two essential features of the same movement. Two ways in which the soul is illuminated, the soul is led, a movement is created, magic happens. Did you guys follow that? Let's see what else. Krishna Surya Sama, Maya Andakar. Yahan Krishna Tahan Nahi, Mayara Adhikar. Maya has no adhikar, no power. Yahan Krishna, where there's Krishna, Tahan Maya. There Maya, Nahi Adhikar. It has no adhikar. Why? Because Krishna Surya Sama. Krishna's like the sun. Maya Andakar. Maya is like darkness, like blindness. Illusion is blindness. Krishna's like the sun. Wherever there's Krishna, there's no darkness. Darkness has no power. That again is this idea that Krishna is the source. Like the scripture is the source. Or the devotee. Actually, it would be more like the devotee is the source. Just like the devotee is the source of divine knowledge, Krishna is the source of divine illumination. Krishna is like the sun. Right? The devotee, the jnanina, those who have knowledge, tattva darshana, those who see the truth, upadekshanti tekyam, they can teach you that knowledge. They can guide you in that knowledge. And Krishna is also sun-like in this sense. He can also point the way. What's the problem with this argument about where Krishna is? Then there's no darkness. What's the problem with that argument? The problem is, how many of you see Krishna on a daily basis? Well, the deity's right there. But how many of you really see Krishna on a daily basis? So now you got a problem. Is that Krishna is like the sun, but somehow or other, I'm not able to see it. And so, Krishna swadhama upagate. Dharma jnanadhi saha. Krishna left for his own abode, accompanied by knowledge and dharma. Dharma jnanadhi, by good action, dharma, and good knowledge, jnana, adhibi, and everything else. Saha, together with all that, Krishna swadhama upagate. He left. He left for his own abode. What do? Krishna's not here. So the sun like Krishna left and is no longer here. So what do? Kalo nashta drishtamesa puranarka. Puranarka. The Bhagavatam, the Purana, which is like a sun. Adhuna udita. Now it has arisen. The Bhagavatam, the Bhagavatam, Puranarka, which is like a sun. Arka means sun. So this book is like the sun. Adhuna, right now, udita, it's arisen. Nashta drishamesha, for those of you who have lost your sight. You've lost your sight. Why did you lose your sight? Because Krishna is like the sun, left, accompanied by knowledge. Therefore, that knowledge which illuminates like the sun and gives you an awareness of who you are, that knowledge is left. You don't have that knowledge anymore because Krishna's gone. But then what happened? Kalo nashta drishamesha. For those of you in this Kali Yuga who have lost your sight, Puranarka adhuna udita. That Bhagavatam has arisen like the sun. And so there's this back and forth play with the devotee and the deity and the sacred text as being conveyors of this light. And when one is gone, the other appears. And one strengthens the other. And one validates the other. And one cross-checks the other. And one checks and balances the other. And they're both really the same thing. They're both ways that Krishna pierces through the fog of this world and creates good fortune for living entities. Sacred texts are essential. They allow you to codify what's really important. They go beyond what anybody can even do in one lifetime. They're the work of generations upon generations of devotees. Beautiful ideas that take generations to codify, to flesh out, to put down for posterity's sake. And then that living, breathing conveyor of that truth that makes it applicable in your life and inspires you by their example, their living example, and their practical knowledge, their ability to apply those teachings in a compelling way and inspire you to get up and pick up that cross and move forward. And that both of those personalities are of Krishna. And Krishna is the sun. And therefore knowledge about Krishna becomes sun-like. And devotees who are devoted to Krishna also become sun-like. And this metaphor of the sun, aditya vat, that gyan, which is like the sun, and this sacred text, which is like the sun, and Krishna himself, who is like the sun, and the devotee also, who is like the sun, and a giver of knowledge who can point the way. I want to try to trace out congruence and paint a picture that made sense. The devotee, upadeshanti tegyam, he can point out that knowledge to you. He's like the sun. Krishna, Surya Sama. Krishna's like the sun. Bhagavatarka, the Bhagavatam is like the sun. Jnana adityavat, the knowledge is like a sun. And how is that knowledge conveyed? Through the devotee. Even through the Lord in the heart, at a certain point. Through the sacred text. And these things work in concert with one another to create a very powerful tradition anywhere in the world. You might even disagree with the tradition. I disagree with so much of the content of Christianity and Islam. I find so many fundamental problems with those teachings. But they have a lineage of people. And they have generations. And they have taken the time to codify it and put it down. And they have staying power. Just the act of doing those things creates the staying power. If you then also have incredibly valuable information and well done information, then you have staying power and you're going to take somebody somewhere. Instead of just helping generation after generation of people fall off a cliff, you'll be able to actually help people get somewhere. Those are some thoughts on these points. Thank you, IGTV. Give me some feedback, guys.